Halito, my name is Monique Verdin, and I am digitally recording this from the banks of the Mississippi River in the lower part of the Delta in so-called New Orleans, but we know this place better as Bvlbancha, which in the Choctaw Muskogee tongue means place of many languages or place of many tongues, because this has been a place where many different peoples have been coming to for as long as there has been land from which trade and exchange could take place. This image here shows the connection to Okwata, the wide water, also known as Lake Pontchartrain, to Bayou Chupik, also known post-colonial days as Bayou St. John, which was the kind of backdoor entry to the high banks closest to the mouth of the big river, the Mississippi. And so I just want to acknowledge and give gratitude for all of my ancestors and all of your ancestors who've made it possible for us to be sharing in this digital space. And also to recognize the Indigenous stewards who have been caring for the lands and waters here, for centuries. And especially to give gratitude to the Mississippi for, if it was not, the life force that runs through this place, bringing water and sediments from homelands to others far upstream, we would have no land here. So gratitude for the water that creates the land and is the life force of the Delta. But yeah, the Choctaw, the Shitamacha, the Homa, the Biloxi, the Washa, the Shawasha, the Shapatulis, the Bayugula, the Atakapa Ishak, the Akola Pisa, the Tunica, and many names of nations that I am not mentioning, and all of those that have been erased and were never recorded in the books of history. They were wiped out during the wave of colonization. And so I have been spending a lot of my adult life thinking about where I come from and what our modern consequences and challenges mean, and how they're connected to history, and how do we learn from that, and trying to find pathways for sustainability as we go into the future. And so this map here was created by a dear friend of mine and collaborator, Jacob Rosenzweig. I'm a huge fan of maps, also knowing that they are illustrations and not 100% accurate representations, which is kind of fascinating to think of in regards to the colonizers' tools. But also just, yes, the visual representations and how data can be shared in that way. I'm so appreciative of. So here you see the boot-shaped state of so-called Louisiana, and the Mississippi River, of course, going down towards the Bird's Foot, and the Atchafalaya, which would be the western edge of the Delta, part of the same system, of course. And so that Mississippi has been shifting back and forth for thousands of years. And in between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya, there's the Bayou Lafourche, which at one point was a main river channel, and is known as La Fourche de la Chitamacha, the fork of the Chitamachas in colonial times. And my ancestors, my Homa ancestors, found refuge in this Yakni-Shido, this big country between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya, connected to the Bayou Lafourche. And, this part of South Louisiana is losing land at one of the fastest rates in Louisiana, and Louisiana is losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet. So this is really ground zero for land loss here. The statistic that is used is that every 90 minutes, they're saying now, which of course is an equation divided over time, multiplied by disaster or something. But yeah, every 90 minutes, a football field is lost from our shores. And I love to share this image of my ancestors. So in the front line here are two great-grandmothers of mine. On the far right, holding the baby, is my great-grandmother Ernestine. And on the other side of the line, in all white with the little child's hand on her shoulder, is my great-grandmother Celestine. And this is in front of her home in the Yakni-Shido in a place known as Point au Chien. Point au Chien, depends who you ask, Point of the Dog or Point of the Oaks. Of course, Bayou Point au Chien, is the Oak Ridge that runs to the south. And at this time, in the late 1920s, those oaks were alive. And you can notice here in the image palmetto roof and a mud and moss chimney. And I just like to kind of share this image, as this was my gateway into understanding where I come from. My grandmother shared this image with me when I was a girl and told me about where she came from, and told me about these times in the late 1920s, 1930s, when oil and gas was coming in and stealing land rights. My grandmother here, Armentine Marie Bayou Verdin, one of my greatest teachers, mentors, friend, and this image was taken as one of the first kind of images I really took with a 35 millimeter camera back in the late 90s. And this was her telling me about what life was like here in this place where she grew up, and how where she picked pecans as a child, my cousins are now setting crab traps in that same territory. This here is a kind of an example of a way of understanding place and time that I've been exploring a bit, which is layering United States Geological Survey maps. So the base layer being one from the 1920s, and then another layer from the 2000s, just to show how what was trembling prairie or marsh, somewhat land, has become open water over time. And then, of course, this image here is a photograph that I took down Bayou Point au Chien, and showing the ghost forest because of saltwater intrusion, because of land loss, because of the 10,000 miles of canals that have been dredged through our wetlands since the 1930s. These skeleton trees are a symbol of what has been lost, and how quickly what was fresh and brackish territories has become salt. So here, this is an image also from down Bayou Point au Chien, and nature does not create straight lines. So this zigzag formation you see is an earthen levee known as the Morganza to the Gulf. And there is, what is inside and what is outside, which is definitely a dividing line of sorts. And also, I would argue maybe sometimes gives us a really false sense of security in knowing that this territory on the other side is becoming open water. And just naturally, because we're in a delta, our land is subsiding, it's sinking. and we don't have new sediments and fresh waters to be replenishing the delta. So that's a natural thing. But since the late 1920s and the Army Corps of Engineers coming in after the Great Flood and restricting the Mississippi from overtopping its banks and doing its natural dance of spreading sediments and building land, but then also industry and extractive practices that we could argue go back to colonial times and the plantation systems. Where sugarcane and sugarcane mostly here in the Delta plantations once sat, we have petrochemical plants that now sit that are connected to this web of pipelines that are tied to our wetlands and to offshore oil and gas facilities, as well as a lot of new pipelines that are, bringing in fracked gas from other parts of the United States. My journey in being a, artist, storyteller, is really connected to this place. This is an oil waste facility in the Yakni-Shido near the community of Grand Bois, Big Woods, which is also a historical Homa settlement. And less than 1,500 feet from where the community is this facility. And I learned, in the late 1990s about this place and the injustices of, Louisiana's loophole laws that like to, have sayings such as, the material here at this facility is non-hazardous, but it has hazardous characteristics, so it can never leave. So this material coming in from offshore oil waste or onshore oil waste, is treated, but then the treated soil can never leave. So there's now this kind of mountain of waste material that's stacking up. And this is just north of some of the fastest disappearing land in the world and just south of what is known as the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, which is a federal navigation canal servicing mostly oil and gas. Love this map in that it's very telling of Greater Bvlbancha, which is that the highest land is closest to the river, which is, of course, because of levees, or in some cases in this image, landfills have some of the highest elevation. But most of the territory is either at or below sea level. And so I find this image, this very, the bends in the river, and now the constriction, as I was saying, with the levee walls, not allowing the Mississippi to follow down, distributaries that would lead to the Gulf of Mexico by going through the estuary system. Now that water and sediment just dumps off of the continental shelf at the end of the river where it meets the Gulf of Mexico. The crawfish is a very symbolic creature in Homa origin stories. They are said to have been it was the crawfish that went to the bottom of the ocean and started building the land. So much appreciation for the crawfish to build the land. They're incredible architects. Each crawfish builds his own crawfish hole, which I find incredibly fascinating. And I love that they kind of live in this in-between state, partly land, partly water. Are the war emblem for the United Homa Nation in that they do not back down. But I think it's really interesting in that the crawfish creates his chimney or his hole, and that there is this practice, of course, along the Mississippi River, but obviously here in the Delta, of mound building culture and building the land. So here you can see that there are many mounds here, and archaeologists are warning that we're losing up to two of these historical either mound sites or village sites to this disappearing land situation that we're up against with, of course the land is sinking and the saltwater intrusion is washing away, but also sea levels are rising at a much more rapid rate than had been predicted. So, the territories are up against a lot of change, and it's happening really quickly. And so here again is this kind of playing with the layering of time and maps. And this is where I live in Greater Bvlbancha down the Bayou Ramblers. So this is one of the southernmost places where the bison would make their migration to. And we know this from the old prairie that's growing here in the territory. And so just to give you an example, here in the right-hand corner is that Mississippi River Gulf outlet. Again, Navigation Canal, federal project, really responsible for much of the flooding that happened in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, and just allowing this kind of shotgun of water to penetrate interior so-called protected, or as they say, risk-reduced areas that are inside levee protection. But this is what they're warning us about. This is, if nothing is done by 2050, what is in red is what will be lost to open waters. And so where many of my relatives live is, at the ends of the roads in the red zone. And I'm just inside levee protection, but I'm in the red zone too. And so, this has been hard to digest. And also I have, over the last 20 years, tried to create a record and tried to use whatever tools necessary to share the story, to raise awareness of what's happening here in the Delta. And along the way, I have been learning that, what started for me as like, oh my God, my cousin's like this image here taken in Grand Bois after a storm in 2004, again, in a flood zone next to a waves facility, that this is part of a much bigger story that's tied deeply to the roots of colonization and manipulation of the landscape. Here, again, man-made canals, over 10,000 dredged through our wetlands since the 1930s. And then here, just showing the infrastructural connections with the petrochemical facilities, as well as this web of pipelines tied to offshore, and taking fuel all the way up to the Northeast and beyond, in international markets as well, which we are the port of New Orleans, so we're connected to the globe. And here again, just this kind of offshore to onshore web of pipelines. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a real wake-up call, in that I had always been thinking of oh, my cousins in the Yakni-Shido are losing land. We're losing land here too, but they were the ones living next to the waste facility. And then when the storm hit in 2005, just up the road from where my family home is in St. Bernard Parish, there was a major oil spill. And it was this whole kind of oh, well, not in my cousin's backyard, it's in my backyard. And what happens when the Gulf of Mexico washes in. Where we live, we had up to 11 feet of water. And this cycle did not begin in 2005, and it surely did not end. And just in 2020, we had this kind of record-breaking cycle of storms all summer long. That was pretty horrifying, and something that is not going away. My grandmother at her home after the storm of 2005, she again had 11 feet of water on her land, had to get out in a pirogue, a little flat bottom canoe. And so now our people are being faced with, do you lift your house 20 feet in the sky or do you leave and go to higher grounds? And so these are the scenarios that are kind of being rolled out. But I've really been leaning more into what does it mean to remain and reclaim, or what does it look like to retreat and return? Because, you know, you take people away from the bayou, you take them away from their ability to literally feed themselves. The bayou side is everything for the Homa Nation. Our sense of sovereignty is tied to food security. And the bayou side is a place of, you know, a gathering place for family. It's also a place of business. This is a place that is important, and when we are, you know, we are just as much a water people as we are a land people here. And so there is a place at the ends of the road in the Yakni-Shudo. It's called Ile de Jean Charles, Island of Jean Charles. Again, another indigenous settlement that has been there for centuries and has lost over 80% of its landmass since the 1930s. So there is this relocation effort that's underway, one of the first, you know, so-called climate relocation projects. It's been complicated, and there are some folks who are refusing to leave, and under the assumption that you know, they want them out, that the state wants people out. But at the same time, there's this kind of phenomena of, like, you know, those who are without means being moved further inland, taken away from the natural resources, and those who have means buying these $500,000 camps at the ends of the road where these old indigenous settlements are, so that they can have weekend getaway homes. So, you know, it's the vulnerability of territories and how those become more desirable as they're disappearing. This kind of layering of the USGS maps has been very telling for me, and just kind of understanding, or maybe just questioning more why and at what time and for what reasons certain things are marked on maps. And again, knowing that maps are the colonizer's tool, but the recognition from the 1920s of this territory being an Indian mound, and then in the 2000s, the same territory, that same site, is no longer noted as being an Indian mound that's over 1,500 years old, but as just a cemetery. And so this Piku Cemetery is where a great ancestor of mine, a Biloxi metal chief, is said to be buried. But again, just this history and how places get renamed and how significance is erased. Here is an elder of mine in Pompare. Pompare is one of the first places where coastal oil and gas extraction happened, and Viviane told me many stories of her family essentially being run out of this community, and I took her there not too many years ago before she passed, and you know, there basically was just a tiny little road and a web of these pipelines crisscrossing this land. The storytelling of maps and the layering of information I've kind of been learning a lot from, so I keep doing them. And here's From Estruma to the Gulf of Mexico is a series of maps that I made for Southern Cultures publication in the summer of 2020. This image should say there's a warning oil and gas pipeline crossing, but yeah, not there. This BP oil spill that happened in 2010 was a really heartbreaking moment. And also I would argue that we're no safer now than we were then. But deep water oil and gas extraction is part of the Coastal Master Plan's it's part of the Coastal Master Plan's ability to finance projects into the future. So royalties coming from deep water oil and gas, that go to the federal trust, and then there is a Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, which allocates a certain amount of those royalties back to the Gulf states. And so state of Louisiana wants to use those royalties to pay for restoration efforts. I question how producing more carbon makes sense in the long-term plan for restoring and creating a balance in this natural system. South Louisiana has been and will continue to be a very important place. This is St. James Parish, which is just north of the city of so-called New Orleans, between New Orleans and so-called Baton Rouge, also known as Estruma. And this is where the Strategic Oil Reserve, or part of it, lives. It also is a territory that is targeted for this incredible plastics expansion and project funded by Formosa. This is the heart of so-called Cancer Alley, and the legacy of the plantation mentality is alive and well here. And I think that in order for us to move forward, we have to recognize that we cannot continue these practices, which are all about short-term gains and long-term harm. I have felt like, a lot of my adult life I've been like, oh, the oil is coming, the land is sinking, the water's rising, and that's all true. But I have been leaning more into, what is possible, and I work with collaborative known as Another Gulf is Possible, which is a network of folks from Brownsville, Texas to Pensacola, Florida, who are engaged in just transition and learning and growing together. And I'm also helping to support a network of Indigenous gardeners. We're calling ourselves Okla Hina Ikshi Holo, which means the people of the Sacred Medicine Trail. And so we have this network of folks who are learning and growing together in many ways, and really leaning into medicine and food sovereignty, and reestablishing old trade routes, and also practices and techniques and ways of working with the medicine and the plants as well, and the food. So here's just kind of a map of where a couple of our sites are. Some further inland, because we know that climate is changing and that we're in vulnerable territory here in the Delta, but also trying to bring some plant material that is in vulnerable territories further north, and propagating plants to also keep them and replant them in our traditional territories as well. And another project that I'm very excited about is called the Float Lab. So Another Gulf is Possible, as well as the Land Memory Bank and Seed Exchange, which is a program of Another Gulf, in collaboration with Mondo Bizarro Productions in Bvlbancha and designer Jeff Becker, as well as a Homa welder, my cousin Monique Verdin, helping us to build out the Float Lab. And that being in relationship with a project called Invisible Rivers. And so this is experimental, and we're trying to think of it as a transformer of sorts. How can it be an exhibition space, a performance space, just recovery vehicle that can be deployed during times of disaster, to have as a charging station, or have as a workshop, or have as a kitchen site. So it's growing and floating, and we're really putting a call out to community to design and to envision what this can be, and just recently blessed the Float Lab in 2021. So that was a very exciting moment, and we're harvesting ideas as we speak and creating more connections and pathways for being a community with youth and elders and everyone in between. And here's this beautiful artwork by our collaborator, Peepin Frisbee Calder, for the Invisible Rivers Project. If you'd like to learn more about the Yakni Shudo, the Neighborhood Story Project helped to produce this collaborative book, Return to Yakni Shudo Homo Migrations, which just came out in 2020 as well. Or 2020. 2020 as well. So thank you so much. This has been an honor to share with you, and much appreciation for listening. And please share with those you know that New Orleans is Bvlbancha, and yeah, that the Mississippi River connects us all. Thank you.
I'm here on the banks of the Bayou Ramblers, just south of the colonial city of New Orleans, in greater Bvlbancha. So the Choctaw called this territory of the lower Mississippi River Bvlbancha, place of many languages, a place of many tongues, because this has been a place and a site of trade, going much further back than colonial times. And actually, this part of the Delta is some of the oldest land in all of the Mississippi River territory, coastal territories. And, you know, the water brought the sediment, which builds the land, which I call home. I'm sitting here in a wild garden on my grandmother's land, and I'm holding a crawfish hole, a chimney of a crawfish, and I'm sitting here next to two really great, beautiful pieces, or chimney holes, crawfish homes to their burrows. I am a citizen of the Homa Nation, and our origin story, which we share with other indigenous folks of the Southeast, is that the crawfish went to the bottom of the water and built the land, and that's where the land originally came from. So, you know, in looking at these examples of crawfish making their homes with the mud and the water and living in these kinds of in-between territories above and below. They're nocturnal, so I've never actually seen a crawfish building its home. But each crawfish hole or chimney is designed and built by an individual crawfish. They don't share. They don't live in community with each other. And some of these can go all the way, you know, 3 to even 6 feet down. Our water table is pretty high here. And this one you see is kind of closed off, which is something that the crawfish will do when it gets cold, or during times of drought, so that they can maintain that water burrow below. So I just think they're really impressive, you know, each crawfish kind of going down and pulling up these balls of clay and mud and constructing these really unique homes. And it reminds me so much of how the mound builders, similarly in opportune times, would use the water sediments to then the water and the sediment deposits from the overflowing, topping of riverbanks, and build these mounds as markers, as ceremonial sites, as homes, as burial grounds. So I'm fascinated by these relationships of the crawfish building the land, and man also creating a sense of home, and defining land using mud in a similar way.